The Return of the Tide by Kathleen Norris. Annie Callahan Curley, bumping her young son Matt ahead of her with a guiding knee, clutching her 4-year-old Helen firmly by a pulpy hand, pushing the perambulator that contained, along with the bread and the canned corn and the graham flour, the plump body of Frank Curley, 17 months old, and managing at one and the same time to grip with firm, thin, worn fingers her flat pocketbook, encountered in Haley's Market none other than her sister Mary Callahan Keene, a bride of 4 months. It was a sweet, sharp, sunshiny morning in November. The little Curleys were well wrapped, and the tips of their microscopic noses were wet and red. Annie wore her thick old coat, and pretty dainty Mary the smart homespun cape with the fur collar that had been a part of her trousseau. The market was full of glancing sunlight and clean color. The cash registers rang and clattered, and clerks dashed about busily, brushing their way without apology between loitering women and snatching at cabbages and boxes of crackers. Mary and Annie smiled in simple pleasure as they met. Mary's first little dainty housekeeping rooms were but 3 blocks from Annie's overrun little household after all, and since the Curleys had come back to Annie's hometown, the sisters saw each other almost daily. But it was pleasant to meet here, as Mary immediately said, grown up, you know, and married, and buying things for their husbands to eat. Mary plumped Helen unceremoniously into the foot of baby Frank's coach with the freedom of familiar aunthood, and Helen squirmed herself somehow into comparative comfort upon the packages and cans. "Hush up, Matt," said Mary then, without heat, to the 7-year-old boy. "Here, what do you want, for the love of Pete?" she added to the child as she opened her pretty, well-filled purse. "half a pound, please," she said imperiously to the salesman, indicating a great opened hogshead of mixed sweet crackers beside her. Matt's steady "Will you, mother? Will you, mother? Will you, mother?" died away into silence behind a toothless grin as he began the attack upon a pink-coated cocoanut confection, and Annie, after a perfunctory murmur of "What do you say, lover?" settled herself happily half supported against the counter for a chat with Mary. She kept the coach moving gently to and fro the length of her arm's reach as they talked. "Did you see Ma today, Mary?" she began. "I was just in there. She wanted me to send her some pork for beans," Mary said, instantly portentous. "I think she looks terrible," she added solemnly, blinking her suddenly misted eyes. Annie's glance at once became grave, and she sighed. "I think she looks terrible," she said drearily. "Frank thinks she looks something terrible," she went on thoughtfully. "She's getting awful old," she said, faintly stressing the last word to express something for which her vocabulary was inadequate. "She's terribly lonely, maybe?" Mary suggested, troubled and perplexed. "Well, she has Marty, and Clark hasn't been gone but a month," Annie answered in the same tone. "Don't give him the frosted ones," she added to Matt, wiping a pink smear from Frank's soft, shapeless mouth. "Give him that graham one. Take sister over there to those boxes, Matt, the way the baby won't see you eating them. I thought maybe I'd stop there, at Ma's, I mean, with the children, going home and give them their lunch there," she finished mildly to Mary. Now, Mary and her brother Jim's wife, Ida, in a recent conference concerning Ma's welfare, had decided that Annie was too easily inclined to walk in upon Ma with her children and impose upon Ma's hospitality for luncheon. It meant building a fire in the kitchen stove, and it meant an exhausting amount of cutting and buttering of bread and tying of bibs and wiping of little mouths. Of course Ma adored it, there was that to be said for it, and she and her oldest daughter could apparently have talked on comfortably for days or months or as pleasantly as for hours at a time, but Ma was not as young as she once had been, and Ida and Mary, one a bride and the other the mother of but one small child, were apt to be a little hard in their judgment of Annie. But Mary was haunted this morning by the thought of Ma as she had just left her, moping, solitary and quiet about the kitchen, and it occurred to her, brisk and radiant in her bridal garments and in the sweet sunshine, that Annie's tribe today might do actual good by lunching with Gaga. Mary herself had her marketing to do, and then she and another young wife, a neighbor, were going into the big city to see a film. Loretta Walsh, as Loretta Keating, had been Mary's intimate friend since third grade days. They would buy a package of dye this afternoon, two chocolate malted milks, four hairnets, and a half-pound of wrapped taffies, a stuffed pickled cucumber in a delicacy shop for Billy Walsh, who loved this particular relish, and a pair of new garters for Daniel Keene, whose old ones, Mary said, were a disgrace. The entertainment and the shopping would consume 4 happy hours. The young women would wander, giggling and with linked arms, through the greatest shopping district of the whole world. Up Sixth Avenue, across 34th Street, they would debate at windows, following passing costumes with critical eyes, discuss bobbed hair and the length of skirts, and they would reach home wearied and sated with the sheer joy and thrill of living, just in time to serve bridal dinners of chops, Saratoga potatoes, and cream puffs from the bakery to the enslaved Billy and Dan. It was many years since Annie Curley had been free for any such idle, aimless enjoyment. The Curleys, unsuccessful in Albany, had recently returned to town to be no more successful here, and Mary, suddenly smitten by the thought and of the change that these three small exacting children must be, and perhaps half consciously touched by the paleness and plainness of Annie's face, stamped already with the first shadow of a new responsibility, said affectionately, "Do go in, Anne. Ma gets so lonely lately. I wish I could, but I sort of promised Loretta—" "Oh, go on with Loretta while you can," Annie said heartily, with a smile on her motherly face. "It won't be forever. How do you feel anyway, Mary?" she asked shrewdly. Mary flushed and laughed, half resentful and half amused. "Oh, for heaven's sakes, Annie, you and Ida are cautions. Every time you look at me, you're sizing me up," she said impatiently. "This morning Ma was having her coffee when I went in, and when I said I didn't want any, for I was just from my own breakfast, you'd die at the look she gave me. 'Does the smell of it make you sick, Mary?' she says. 'No, Ma,' I says in a regular yell. 'I love it. The smell of coffee is a regular perfume to me. I'll tell you when there's any news,' I says, 'and until then I wish to goodness you and Annie would lay off me.'" Annie laughed indulgently and deprecatingly as the trim and pretty Mary vigorously delivered her protest, with her pink cheeks growing pinker under her snug veil and her square, slim shoulders erect under the brown cape. "I know," she said apologetically, "but there's no happiness like it, Mary," she reminded her sister as she settled Frank, made Helen comfortable, and prepared to go upon her way. "So I see," Mary said significantly and satirically. Annie only laughed again. She would not have given up one kiss in the damp back of young Frank's neck for all the shopping, for all the shows in Christendom, but there was no possible way of persuading Mary of that. No need yet awhile, thought Annie in her motherly fashion. "But say, listen, Annie," Mary said suddenly, just as they were about to part. This was the customary proceeding. They would now exchange, after their first farewells, the real news of the day, if news there were. "Listen, Annie," said Mary. "Dan and I were talking about Christmas this morning. What are you and Frank planning to do?" "I wish we could have all you and Josie and John, too," Annie said wistfully, "but I don't know how I could manage it." "You'd be crazy to try it," Mary assured her heartily. "And I suppose poor Ida won't have a family dinner," she said thoughtfully. Ida, their brother's wife, had lost a little son not much more than a year before, a tragedy that had plunged all the different branches of the family into bitter sorrow. The Jim Callahans had Cecilia left, to be sure, and a lovely little girl she was, but for Jim, the adored one brother of the family, to lose his splendid little Frances who was so clever and so handsome and so generally adored, was a frightful blow to them all. Frances's mother had been rendered almost chronically melancholy, and Ma Callahan had suddenly seemed to collapse into age and grief under the sorrow. For months the women of the family brooded upon all the horrors of the child's last hours, upon the funeral and the days preceding the funeral, when he lay so quiet and so beautiful in his white serge First Communion suit, looking with his dropped long black lashes upon his rosy, handsome little face like an angel already. The months had brought some little comfort to Ida. She knew now that St. Valentine's Day would find another baby in her arms. She would go to Annie's cluttered, crowded flat and sit for hours with Annie's fat, healthy baby in her lap, and although down Ida's cheeks would pour the quiet tears that 4-year-old Cecilia wiped away again and again, yet she grew quieter, and the very weeping seemed to relieve her. And then in August there was Mary's wedding, and all the excitement attendant upon the establishment of one more little home in the world, and Josie and John Concannon had come down from Albany with their 4-year-old, Rose Agnes, in her white coat with the beaver collar, and there had been much felicity and innocent mirth among them all. But Jim Callahan never for an instant forgot his boy, and there was a certain new and weary droop to his big shoulders, and a pathetic, seeking look in his eyes in these days, and Ma Callahan grieved so for her grandson that her daughters sometimes told each other fearfully that it'd be the death of her yet. She liked best to sit in her kitchen, that clean and empty and quiet kitchen that had been the theater for so many young tragedies and comedies, so much eager young living and talk of the past, and especially of little Frances with Annie or Kate Oliver or some other member of the family. If chance supplied a fresh listener, some quiet little neighborhood mother with awed eyes and with a baby tugging at her breast, then Mrs. Callahan would review the whole terrible thing from beginning to end. If only she had spoken to Ida when she did be noticing that little Francis looked as pale as a curd, she would lament. That was the Tuesday, mind you, and they didn't have the doctor to him until the Thursday night. The hands on him was as cold as ice, but then he'd been out with all the sodality boys, and sure, she thought it was no more than that he had had a cold or he was tired. Well, then, and on Wednesday morning, the tale ran, he stepped in on his way to school, and he had a great way with him that he'd be getting out of you what he wanted, mind you, and him as grave as a bishop. Gaga, he says, holding up the little bold face of him the way I could kiss him, and me hands in the dough. And Mrs. Callahan's tears would begin to fall fast, remembering the beaming little face that was so soon to vanish from among the other beloved faces, and the busy little plotting, loving heart that in a few brief days would lie cold and still. Annie and Mary came to dread those recitals. Their anxious eyes, perhaps tear-filled in turn, would watch her while she rocked, sighed, wept, and recalled the agonizing details one after another. Last Christmas had been terrible, and now here was another Christmas upon them, and it behooved Mary the bride and Ida, for the sake of her unborn child, and Annie, always a tower of strength and help, to make it as easy as possible, perhaps even happy for Ma and Jim. The Concannons might come down, and they would all be together. Anyway, they must brace up, the sisters decided, and make the best of the situation. "Ma's simply not fit to have all the excitement and fuss," Annie offered dubiously, "and Ida expecting, you couldn't ask it of her. It'd kill her." "No, but this is what I was thinking," Mary said. "Ida and Jim have got a spare room, and we have too. Now if Josie and John came down to them, quietly, you know, and not exciting Ma in the least, and then if I took Rose Agnes at our house, Dan'd love it. He's cracked about kids anyway, and then if we got a frozen pudding made at the tea shop, they're perfectly delicious." "Say, Mary, I think that would be wonderful," Annie said radiantly. "Matt, just be Mother's patient, darling boy. Just a minute. Mother's coming right along," she interpolated to her impatient eldest. "I'll tell you what I can do," she said eagerly. "Frank's sure to win one of those 20-pound turkeys in the raffle at the club. He always does. And the Cottle Works always give their married employees turkeys anyway, and I'll roast the 2 turkeys and bring them right over. Frank'll manage that. We won't say one word to Ma." "Ida'll make the cranberry," Mary added, "and vegetables are nothing. The canned ones are just as good if you leave them in a colander for 2 hours or more." "Well, hear the old housekeeper!" Annie laughed in fond pride. Mary flushed happily and consciously. Well, they are, she said. We could have a soup. The bean soup and the tomato mixed is simply grand. Loretta had it the other night. It was grand, really. And then the turkeys and fixing, and then dessert. That's oceans. I'll tell you what we'll do. We won't say one word to Ma until Christmas itself. You ask her to your house and say it's going to be just your own family. And then about 11, we'll walk in on her. I'll give the children a late breakfast, or maybe he would keep them for me until about 1, Annie interrupted enthusiastically, because we don't want noise or racket, and then we'll clean them all up and we'll all go, Ida and Cecilia and Jim and John and Josie with Rose Agnes and Frank and me with our three and you and Dan. That'll be That'll be 12, 13 with Ma. We can't sit down 13." She paused, and Mary frowned thoughtfully. Marty, she remembered suddenly, the small derelict that Mrs. Callahan had adopted years before, had been visiting Josie in Albany and had been delayed for weeks instead of the originally intended days for measles. "He and Rose Agnes will be all over the measles by then," Mary announced in satisfaction, "and Rosie will bring him down. Ma's always happier when she has Marty anyway, and she has lots of china and scads of napkins. You and I'll just put her in a chair and keep everything serene, and Ida and Josie can heat things up, and then all the children will come in, and afterward we'll just let her talk to Jim quietly, and we'll clean up every last spoon and send the children home and have a real good visit with her alone." Annie was so excited and so pleased by this plan, and Mary so inspired to perfect it by fresh details, that, but for the enraged impatience of young Matthew Curley to get home, and the sudden whimpering of little Frankie for his noontide baked potato and top milk, the sisters might easily have spent another hour or 2 hours in rapturous communion, but Annie's motherly compunction suddenly awoke, and Mary remembered her engagement with Loretta, and they hastily parted, both still wrapped delightedly in the thought of Christmas conspiracy, even while Mary raced home to drop her parcels and run for the subway, and Annie, hungry, tired, and confused, engineered her hampered way toward Ma's. Of this loving little maneuver to give Ma Callahan all the joy of a Christmas reunion without the nervous anxiety and effort of arranging it, Frank, Dan, and Jim approved, each in his separate individual way. Dan exultantly kissed his wife and said he'd bet it was all her idea and that she was a wonder. Frank, with whom affairs at the ironworks were not going well, and who was still worried about the bills from Annie's last illness, also kissed his wife more soberly and gave her the proud and tender smile she loved, and told her that nothing but blessings could follow a daughter that was as good as she was. And mind you, if he didn't win a turkey this year, but all the fellows thought he had the luck of the old boy himself about it, she was to buy a big turkey and pay for it. The children were all well, God bless them, and the only thing now was that 82 to Doc Pocock, and they'd squeeze that out very easy without scrimping on the Christmas turkey, said Frank. Annie's whole soul went out to him in a wave of love and gratitude. They had just been bringing themselves to face in the last few days the probability of the coming of a fifth child. Annie had lost one baby before birth, but there were three hungry, dirty, wet, exacting, restless, wakeful little Curleys in the six-room apartment now, and Frank had money worries, and the cost of everything necessary to safe and comfortable living was what he called cruel. Only he and Annie knew what it all meant, the utter madness of fatigue and worry and work, the mountains of tiny cares that crushed all the sweetness out of living for a while, endless nights, stumbling errands about the darkened rooms in the chill of midnight, sour bottles, wash tubs piled high with dirty, worn, buttonless little garments, and always the whining, crying, fretful little voices. Annie knew every detail of it, and yet she had said to Frank 2 or 3 nights before, "Let's have the first thing we say of this baby be 'God bless him, Frank.'" And she kissed her husband now when his patient goodness could go on beyond her and the children and extend to Ma with a rush of love and confidence that no hardship and struggle could do anything but deepen. "Easier than poor Ida, Frank," she said, thinking of Frances's little grave piled with a second winter's snows, and Frank, drawing his own splendid boy toward him, reverently nodded. Jim approved the Christmas plan with his new sad, quiet smile. If Ida could stand it, he said questioningly. Ida's tears rushed to her eyes and said bravely yes, that she would like it, and that Cecilia would love being with Gaga and all the children. Ida had never been a pretty woman, but she had filled out in her 7 married years, and she did not wear her glasses so much, and she was the most domestic of all the young wives in the family. She got into Jim's lap, and Cecilia, the exquisite and blue-eyed 4-year-old, with a flyaway mop of pure gold hair, clambered in too, and they all clung together. "You won't mind, Jim?" Ida pleaded, remembering last Christmas when she and Ma and Jim had battled through a bitter snowstorm to the new little grave in the Flushing cemetery, and that Ma had had a chill after it, and that Annie and her young ones had come over to Ma's, and how they had all got to crying in the Christmas evening. "No, my darling," he answered gravely with a deep, patient sigh. "It isn't like a regular family Christmas," Ida said, "because we really have to think of your mother, Jim, and save her now. It's all going to be managed very quietly, with no strain and no confusion, and she'll not have any of the trouble or fuss at all. And next Christmas, Jim, dear," she went on timidly, "next Christmas will be happier, won't it, Jim? You will feel happier, won't you? Especially if it's a little boy that God sends us." "I think maybe another girl would be better. I don't know. It seems like a boy would put him out of his place," Jim said thickly but steadily. "I guess we'd love the little feller, but he wouldn't be my Francis. 2 years since we gave him his coaster." And he got up slowly, placing her and Cecilia gently in the chair he left, and went heavily into the kitchen like an old man, and she heard the outer door shut. Ida, burying her wet face in Cecilia's mop, wept her heart out. If only there didn't ever have to be a Christmas again. Launched in a whirl of enthusiasm, the conspiracy for Ma's happiness was destined to encounter disheartened squalls. The chief of these was the attitude of Ma herself to the once welcome holiday season. She appeared to be totally indifferent to all talk of Christmas trees, presents, family reunion. Discouraged but not daunted, Annie duly asked Ma to have a quiet Christmas dinner with Frank and herself and the children. Ma accepted lifelessly. Poor Ida and Jim would be going to the graveyard, she opined. "Maybe Josie and John'll be down and bring Marty home," Mary hinted one day, really alarmed at her mother's apathy. Marty, Mrs. Callahan's adopted child, was the very apple of her eye. "I hope they won't, then," her mother answered despondently and firmly. "Why, they'd bring the poor child down to a forlorn old woman like me when he's safe and happy with them, the dear knows. I'll come over and have a bite of dinner with Annie, but I hope that none of you'll go to any fuss with turkey and ice cream. Poor Jim's heart is broke out of him without his boy, and Mary just married. Who knows but what Dan would want to take her to his folks in Wilkes-Barre for Christmas Day." "We went there Thanksgiving, Ma darling," Mary said tenderly and patiently. "Ah, please do try to cheer up for Christmas, dear," she pleaded. "I don't know why I would," her mother faltered with watering eyes, and she froze their hearts within them by adding in an undertone, "Maybe I'm tired. Maybe it's just I'm getting to the end of my road." Josie raised another objection almost as depressing. Josie was the middle daughter, most prosperously married to a physician in Albany, and with a beautiful home and a motor car and a general promise of rising to social heights that would have paralyzed her own Irish grandfather with sheer terror. She wrote that although she and John had not seen Ma for 6 months, they were sure that the big family party at home would be too much for her. She was failing, there was no question about it, and that raft of children and all the chatter and excitement might kill her. Besides, Ida was expecting in a few weeks, and poor Jim was simply crushed after little Francis's death, and it would be an awful struggle for Annie to roast turkeys and get the children clean and all the rest of it. Now, why wouldn't it be better to give the children a nice early dinner, say at 4 o'clock on Christmas Day, and then all go into New York and have a fine restaurant dinner with John and herself as hosts? John thought that would be the only sensible thing to do, and then he and she could take the 10 o'clock train back to Albany, and the others go home when they pleased. She would leave Rose Agnes with John's mother in that case, as the excitement of the long trip and the full day would be too much for the child. Mary, Ida, and Annie raged when they had this letter. Josie had been suspected of a certain airy sense of superiority more than once. Now they were sure that she was completely spoiled. Egged on by the others, Annie wrote her a firmly reproachful letter assuring Ida and Mary that if Joe wanted to get her feelings hurt, why, they simply would have to be hurt. That was all. But Jo replied meekly and submissively as it happened, and so re-established herself in their hearts. Her letter, 3 days before Christmas, brought comfort and courage to them all. She would come, of course, and bring Rose Agnes and Marty, and they'd all go in upon Ma at noon on Christmas Day and help cook dinner and have a perfectly gorgeous time. By this time a threatened change in the management of the ironworks was, however, unduly worrying Frank Curley, and Annie was sure that her suspicions as to her own condition were justified, and Jim had pleaded off from attending the Christmas party. He'd be all right, he said. He'd just take a long walk. Ida, who knew where the long walk would lead him, cried herself to sleep on the eve of Christmas Eve with disappointment, and Annie felt ready to die with utter discouragement and heartache. But Christmas Eve came in with a whirling, glorious snowstorm, and in the cold, sunless morning, Josie, looking stunning in her furs, and her big John and little dancing Marty and Rose Agnes all arrived with a carload of packages and 1,000 cold and laughing kisses. Annie's kitchen became a riot of voices and shouts. Ida and Cecilia came over, and after work that afternoon Jim stopped in and kissed his sister and talked to blue-eyed little Rose Agnes in his kind, sorrowful voice. And Ma never dreamed. Ma hadn't the slightest notion. Ma was as innocent as an angel, they told each other exultingly over and over. And she told me yesterday, Mary said, that she thought she'd never let another Christmas go by again without making an effort. She said she wished she'd asked Joe to send Marty down. She said she didn't think she'd live to see another Christmas. For heaven's sakes, Josie exclaimed, turning from one face to another in distress. That doesn't sound like Ma. Is she as blue as all that? "Oh, my!" Annie and Ida and Mary all ejaculated together, shaking their heads in mournful triumph. "You wouldn't know her, Joe. She's just, well, she's a different woman." Josie made no answer in words, but her eyes watered with a sort of angry and incredulous pain. The girls were exaggerating, she thought resentfully. She had come from her trim little home, her nicely managed little establishment with its clean Danish girl in the kitchen and its delightful order and prosperity, and everything here in the old environment looked shabby, shiftless, unnecessarily ugly to her. After the first flush of meeting Annie, she had noted the general poverty and plainness of Annie's house, and the worn, patient courage of Annie's soul and body. She had at once suspected Annie's secret, and the fact itself annoyed her, as well as the fact that Annie did not tell her about it. Another baby, Jo thought despairingly, her intolerance springing from sheer affection for and loyalty to Annie, and yet hurting Annie far more than mere indifference would have done. Then Jim hurt her too, for Josie adored her only brother, and the thought that this wretched attempt at merrymaking tomorrow was to be made without him cut her to the heart. No, he said quietly to her, coaxing. He'd a little rather not try it tomorrow. They weren't to worry about him. They weren't to think about him at all. He'd be all right. He saw Ma all the time. He went in every other day to see her, and she would understand. To put a final touch upon Josie's discouragement, young Marty, who had been visiting her, developed a thick, painful throat this evening. If Marty had mumps, then of course Rose Agnes would have mumps, and probably the whole Curly nursery would catch them, and perhaps poor Ida, who never had had them, and who was in no condition to fight any illness. Josie wished heartily that they had never attempted this ridiculous party. John and Frank and Jim and Danny, warned not to go near Ma, went out after dinner to see old friends in the neighborhood. But the women sat about in Annie's crowded parlor, putting the finishing touches on Christmas dolls and beribboned doilies, and taking in continually sinking and saddening, talking and continually sinking and saddening voices of the family matters. And Josie was conscious only of a desire to scream at them all that they were a helpless, stupid, fearful lot, and then grab her baby and rush back to her own home where women read the backs of magazines and men were not afraid of losing jobs. Frank Curley had nothing to be afraid of. He was a master mechanic after all, and there were other ironworks in the world. To have Annie, who had been so pretty and so neat, sighing here and wiping her eyes and biting threads. Marty, asleep upon a lounge, woke up fretful. His throat hurt. The women looked at each other appalled. "Try him on a teaspoonful of vinegar, Joe," Annie whispered as they threaded their way between the filled beds in the dark bedroom. "My goodness, I wish we could ask Ma." They were to reach Ma's just at noon the next day. By 11 o'clock they were all tired to the breaking point. Annie had dragged herself to Mass, sick and dizzy, had come back to roast turkey and boil potatoes, even while every fiber of her being was in revolt at the mere smell of food. She spoke to the children gently, screamed at them, and spoke gently and apologetically again. Frank did his best, buttoning clean rompers wrongly and misunderstanding directions. Marty, Matt, Helen, and even the baby were reminded that they must make no noise at Gaga's. Gaga was not well. To Ida's Cecilia the directions were repeated, and to Josie's exquisite Rose Agnes, over and over again the sisters arranged their plans. The turkeys would be in Ma's oven, and the ice cream on Ma's back porch, before she fairly knew what was afoot. Through a sweet, clean Christmas noon of dazzling snow and bright sunshine, with bells ringing and holiday joy abroad in every red-painted coaster and consciously worn fur collar, they presently trooped to the old house. By this time the children were in wild spirits, and John and Dan laughing together, and even to Annie's lifeless cheek an unwonted, happy flush had sprung. The gate creaked. They were up the path. They were at the door. How well they knew the rubbed, dirty space about the bell and the penciled Roslyn 369 that some impatient messenger had scrawled there. A long delay, then Ma at last, with an amazed, almost truculent look in her handsome face and one big bare foot. She had been soaking her foot in a bucket of warm water. She looked as if her privacy had been somewhat outraged. "Well, whatever," she said dryly. "I thought I was going to Annie's. And you're down, Josie? Forevermore. Take this cap off. Take his cap off, Frank, for the Lord's sake, the way he won't have his ribbons all chewed to nothing on you. It's a wonder you wouldn't let a body know. I've a taste of stew in the ice box, and that's all." Even their greetings, their resolute laughter and comment could not quite carry it, could not make the ensuing hours a success. Even when the kitchen stove and the stove in the parlor were roaring hot, and the presents had been given, and the table enlarged and set, and the cranberry sauce divided into glass saucers, there was a consciousness of something forced in their hilarity and something missing to their felicity. The women chattered courageously. Ma wasn't to do anything, but they did everything gaily as they moved to and fro. Annie's face blazed. She looked her pretty self again with her red cheeks and shining eyes. She had pinned on a great stiff white apron and put a cluster of red berries into her lifeless, meekly locked hair. Mary was irresistible, and Josie merry and affectionate and full of stories and gossip that were new. Ida sat near her mother-in-law, a little breathless and more than a little apprehensive. She kept running over the months upon nervous fingertips. June to February came out 9, and over, and yet she did have a queerish feeling. The men helped clumsily, eagerly, or stood about, large and awkward, smoking. Any little topic of conversation that they could keep moving they followed with passionate seriousness. Also, they spoke frequently to the children, who were beginning to feel restless and hungry as the clock struck 2. It was Ma who was responsible for all this discomfort. Ma, who in old times had been the animated, garrulous, loving, dictatorial heart of all their groups, was oddly changed and aged today. She received them magisterially, With a certain aloof dignity, she watched them, she listened, she considered her answers. There was a stiffness, a sort of tacit disapproval in her manner that made them all uneasy. This had been home to her three girls once, but nobody felt at home here today. The irresistible currents of life had drawn them away one by one, and they were alien here. The depth and passion of their mother's love had only been able to show itself, after all, in endless little services and the daily intimacies of coffee cups and ironing board. Now those services were no longer needed, and those intimacies had been long interrupted, and she felt her children to be strangers. More than that, her only son was absent, roaming the snowy world desolate and alone, his big heart aching for his son, and when she remembered Jim, Mrs. Callahan's heroic struggle to seem natural and happy died away in ashes and despair. It was a fine Christmas day, whatever, she reflected, without a sight or sound of the lad. Do you know, I think she would have liked it better if we'd put the whole job up to her, Mary murmured despondently to Annie in a moment of privacy. I believe she'd have liked to do it. I'm afraid it's kind of hurt her, our taking it out of her hands. I think so too, Josie agreed, stricken. She acts so funny. She just answers yes and no, not a bit like Ma. Well, we'll have to go on with it, Annie answered, sighing, for the dinner was in the actual process of dishing up. Annie was on her knees at the oven. The two great turkeys smoked deliciously. The mashed potatoes was a little Fujiyama of white and gold. From an Epicurean standpoint, nothing could have excelled the meal. Ma herself had never roasted more wonderful turkeys. Josie's biscuits were perfection. There were gravy and jelly and dressing and corn pudding for a multitude. The children stuffed past plates and stuffed anew. Their elders showed only slightly inferior appetites, and yet there was a singular heaviness in the air. Ida secretly mourned for her absent Jim, and counted the months from June to February with a sinking heart. Annie filled Frank's plate with the choicest bits of everything, timidly watching for his smile. Josie talked gallantly, although a certain feverish heaviness upon the part of little Rose Agnes was making her heart stand still with terror. She reminded later she reminded Mary later that after all it was Dan's first Christmas with the family. It would be a nice thing to have him think that they were all deaf mutes. Ma Eight complimented the cooks punctiliously, addressed herself principally to her grandchildren. Once she remarked that little Frances had been with them at Christmas time 2 years ago, and wondered aloud who would go next. Failure. The family dinner was an absolute failure. Annie could have wept, thinking of the money and time and effort that had been wasted to force this wretched affair into being. The men were heavy, dull, and in the way when the ice cream and cake were finished at 3 o'clock, and the children were ubiquitous and quarrelsome. Their grandmother roused herself only apathetically to reprimand them. She said that if Jim had gone to the cemetery, he'd likely get to his death too, a day like this. The sun had gone behind leaden clouds, and a cold raw wind was blowing over the sunless snow. Josie was practically and briskly preparing the six children for a good half-hour's play of outdoors when her husband, in his capacity as doctor, interfered. It would be dangerous, flushed and tired and excited as they were, to send them out so late in the winter afternoon, he said. No, Rose Agnes positively should not go. No, it was not safe. John was always so gentle and kind that Josie felt his tacit reproof like a blow. Tears were in her eyes as she wiped glasses and spoons and knives and plates and plates and plates at the old familiar sink. Ida was ready for tears too. It was a strange Christmas day without Jim, and Annie was exhausted almost to the point of joining them. She felt as if it were physically impossible for her to get home this afternoon and get Frank a cup of tea and tumble the children into beds. She fairly ached with fatigue. Put your coat on, Frank dear, and step up toward the cemetery and see if maybe you can't get hold of Jim and tell him how bad Ma feels, she whispered over the hot, clean knives. Don't worry, darling, she added, kissing him tenderly as he turned to obey. But as the patient, shabby shoulders disappeared in the stiff, thick old coat, she felt a dry ache of tears in her throat, and she ran after him to kiss him again. Mary was secretly distressed too for all her noisy, mirthless chatter because Dan wanted to get away for the 5:12 run of The Price of Her Lie. It was opening at the Plaza today, and Dan knew the fellow in the ticket office who had said that he would always take care of Dan in the matter of tickets. To Mary it did not seem quite decent to run away from the family on Christmas Day. Ma had never let them go to shows on Sunday night, and she would surely suspect and perhaps anger Dan with a sharp word on the subject. So she managed to keep away from Dan's neighborhood, and Dan appreciated it perfectly and resented it. Ma, Josie asked anxiously, how do you know when it's mumps? I suppose by taking them into a hospital and cutting something out of them, her mother replied witheringly, and although Josie joined in the laugh that followed, it was not without a glance half pitying and half pleading to Ma. The shabby old rooms were very hot and heavy with food odors now, and in frightful disorder. Christmas toys were mingled in among the mussy plates and tumbled napkins, and the steamed windows were marked by dirty little sticky fingers. It was Matt Curley, masticating an immense hard chocolate candy and lounging in youthful ennui against one of these windows, who said suddenly over the general hubbub of the dining room, "Oh, gee, look, it's a drunk. Oh, no, it's not. They're bringing him in. It's a man that's been killed." God save us! What's the child talking about? Annie muttered as she and Mary and Josie flew to the window. Oh, God be good to us! God be good to us! She said in a deep, hard tone that rang through the room. One moment peaceful dishwashing and cheerful Christmas disorder, and the next moment this view of the familiar yard, the gate blocked with snow, the bare lilacs rattling in a bleak wind under a sullen sky, and the men, strange, silent, huddling men in their heavy, worn overcoats, bringing something in. There were screams and the stamping of quick feet, and the children were pushed aside. A bitter draught of icy out of door air clove through the thick, food scented rooms. Big, muddy feet tramped in. The cluttered table was shoved aside. They laid Frank Curley down upon the dining room lounge. To the half circle of pallid faces, terrified women, some man gruffly and awkwardly spoke. It was Cottle's car. Poor Frank was up by the ironworks. He'd asked some fellow there had he seen Jim Callahan. It was Cottle's fault. There was a cop right there, and he said so. Oh, God, help us! God preserve us! The women whispered, their eyes upon the helpless, sodden lump that was Frank. A great gasp and shudder went through the craning group when Mary, her young face ashen, gently eased the crushed head upon a crimson velvet cushion, and Frank moaned. Suddenly Annie came through the press, Annie with the freckles showing upon her pale, strained face and the years of patient motherhood stamped upon her flat, thin body, Annie with work-worn hands and her sweet, trembling mouth. She sank quietly upon her knees beside him and took the torn, discolored hand that had been roughly rolled in mud and snow in her own hand, and her thin cheek rested upon his rich, disordered hair. Over and over again the motherly voice said softly, breathlessly, Frank, my sweet, my own true husband. She looked bewilderingly at John Concannon as he gently put her aside. Josie, crying, was holding a basin of water. Mary, ashen-faced, was behind the couch, supporting the stained, muddy head. In the background there was a huddle of terrified faces. Annie saw her baby boy in the high chair with his big new ball in his fingers, and with a piteous trembling of his little mouth, she caught him to her flat breast, stumbled into the kitchen, Matt and Helen clinging to her blindly, and found herself and her children suddenly caught in her mother's great arms. "Come now, darlin'," said the familiar voice, with all its old heartening vitality and ring. "Annie, be a dear woman. He'll want to see you the minute he opens his eyes. It's only a bad fall, dear. Take courage to yourself. Ma." It was poor Ida, forgotten in the last few minutes of the uproar, but staggering with pain and clinging tightly to the big comforting shoulder. "Ma, I don't know that I can get home." Mrs. Callahan, distracted in spite of herself, fixed alert eyes upon her son's wife. With Ida writhing and helpless, and Annie sunk in a stupor of agony upon a chair, her children pale and frightened about her, a sudden energy and courage, almost youthful, seemed to descend like a visible mantle upon their mother. "The dear Lord stand by," she said, richly and heartily concerned. "Don't you have a moment o' worry, Ida dear, you'll be fine. Mat, take a handful o' wood and run up to Aunt Josie's old room and make a grand little fire in the stove," she commanded. "Get hold of Uncle Dan, Helen, and tell him Gaga wants him. I'll send Mary upstairs with you, dear, and you just take everything easy. It'll all be over very quick this time. I told you so a month ago. John's here when you need him, and as soon as poor Frank feels better, sit where you are, Annie, and keep the baby in your arms, you poor girl, you. I'll go in and find out how things are going." Brisk, capable, resourceful, she stepped from her kitchen with the old erect step of long ago. She immediately assumed control of everything that was passing in the dining room. Somehow the onlookers scattered and the children disappeared and the door was closed, and by degrees, with here a little help from Josie and there a little more from Mary, the big table was cleared and pushed empty against a wall, and order succeeded chaos.